Hello, my name is John Burke, Nemertes Principal Research Analyst. Welcome to our monthly webinar entitled Securing the Internet of Things by Nemertes Research CEO, Johna Johnson. This webinar consists of an interactive presentation and moderated Q&A period. To submit a question, please use the control panel on GoToWebinar. If you experience any technical difficulties, please contact webinars@nemertes.com. On conclusion of the webinar, you will be presented with a short survey. Please answer the questions to provide feedback on this webinar and to suggest content for future ones. We also ask if you would like to participate in our research. In exchange for your participation, you would receive access to our research. A replay will soon be available for viewing on our website. With that, let's go ahead and get started, and I'll turn things over to Johna.
Great, thanks, John. And let's jump to the next slide where I can walk us through the agenda very quickly. Okay, perfect. So as folks can see, first of all, welcome everybody. Good afternoon for those of us on the East Coast. Good morning for those of us on the West Coast, and good evening for those of you who are in the shadow of night. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of information about Nemertes, then talk about some key drivers behind IoT, and then we'll zero in on the very specific area of IoT security. We're going to introduce the concept of shadow IoT because it becomes very, very important. Then we're going to walk through what the next steps should be and highlight some additional resources and how to get at them. And then John will introduce the next webinar, and we'll move right to Q&A. So with that, next slide, please. Keep going. Perfect. So here we are. This is Nemertes Research. We're a global IT research and strategic consulting company. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I do want to highlight a couple of things. We'll be highlighting results from two distinct research studies that we've done very recently. One is our digital transformation study, and the other one is our security and risk management study. These are global studies. They cover IT professionals, and in the case of digital transformation, as we'll talk about, business professionals in 12 countries, 3 regions, and roughly 600 participants. And we'll talk about the security study in depth shortly. So this information is from interviews and surveys across the globe in a couple of different areas. That's what we do for a living, and we've been doing it for 15 years. Thanks. Next slide, and then the slide after that. Okay. So the first key item is, why do we care about IoT? Well, for those of you who have IoT initiatives in place already, you probably know why you have IoT initiatives. But for those of you who don't have IoT initiatives in place but are considering digital transformation, one of the fascinating conclusions of the study that we recently conducted was that companies with successful digital transformation initiatives have 3 times. That's 3 times more IoT initiatives underway than less successful companies. And you can see the numbers here, 15 times 3 being 45. Now, you may be asking, and I'm sure lots of folks are asking, how do you measure success for digital transformation? Let me just say we have several objective business measures for digital transformation success. I'm not going into them in this presentation because this is more about IoT security, but I want to highlight that this success is not just a subjective measure, but also an objective measure. Next slide, please. Perfect. Thank you so much. So what are the, one of the things that we asked as part of this study was, what are the drivers? What are the top drivers for IoT from a business perspective? And I just want to highlight 2 things. One is participants in this digital transformation study were both technology professionals and business professionals, about half and half, about 300 each. So we got different perspectives from those business leaders, from those IT leaders, and then the green, the folks in teal are hybrid leaders. But as you can see, for IoT, the top drivers tended to be things like improving customer experience and, no surprise, driving revenue. Reducing costs, improving employee productivity, and gaining competitive advantage tended to be less important. So it's really critical for folks to think about what is the purpose of IoT before we then get into the sub-question of why are we trying to secure IoT? But to answer that next question, we should go to the next slide, please. The first thing to understand is that IT, and by IT that includes InfoSec in this broader study, funds almost half the time funds IoT initiatives. And then the next group of folks includes sales, finance, and marketing, as well as product development. Again, these are business folks are telling us where the funding is coming from. So for the first time ever, a research firm has good insight into what IoT is doing from outside the IT environment. The second thing is to see that nonetheless, IT is still a very primary funder for IoT initiatives, and therefore has some real reason to be involved, soup to nuts, in the entire initiative. I also just want to highlight again, it makes sense that in each of these cases, you've got different business groups that have as their primary goals, as we talked about, improving customer experience and driving revenue. So no surprise that sales and marketing are up near the top here. Finally, it should be self-evident, but these do not sum up to 100 because obviously lots of initiatives get funded from a bucket of money. So just to keep that in mind. The important thing is IT is involved almost twice as often as any other business group. Next slide, please. Why are people not doing IoT? The biggest IoT inhibitor here is, surprise, surprise, security. Well, okay, in all fairness, it's also budget. They're both at 20%, but security really is top of mind when we interviewed folks, and rightly so. As most of us are well aware, physical networks and physical devices can become major vulnerabilities inside organizations and have been the source of really well-known breaches over the past several years. And in fact, most companies, as you'll see, do not have a good process in place to protect across the board. So basically what we've said thus far is IoT is important because it's a critical component of digital transformation. It's also important because, quite frankly, it can help you improve your customer experience and drive revenue, two things that are very, very important to any organization. Even not-for-profits need to improve their customer experience. And security is the biggest speed bump in the path of deploying IoT, so maybe we really need to delve into what makes it work well. And with that, next slide, please. So one of the things I want to highlight here, thanks, John. One of the things I want to highlight here is IoT success factors, IoT security success factors. And here I am going to take the time to walk through what success means in the context of IoT and of security. What we did was we actually measured security operational response to incidents. And we broke this down very granularly, and we have lots of great granular data around this and also process information. That's not the point of this particular slide. The point here is we asked two sets of questions, one around operational metrics, and the other one was a self-assessment of security. And what we found of success, security success. And what we found was that the successful group, which we identified as people who rated themselves 8, 9, or 10 out of a scale of 1 to 10, had literally 60 times faster, better response time in terms of responding to security incidents than people who rated themselves at a 7 or below. What that tells us is that's a very, very powerful correlation that tells us that the people self-classify pretty well if we use, that 8 and above as the break point, and that has a meaningful impact on overall success of the organization. So essentially, as we go through, we're going to look at what successful organizations are doing more of and less successful organizations are doing less of when it comes to IoT security. Next slide. First thing to look at is successful companies are a heck of a lot more likely to have assessed IoT. What we mean is we asked organizations what the current state of IoT was, and then we broke down the answers into those two bars, the yellow bars being the less successful and the blue bars being more successful. And what you find, next slide please, is that the blue bars, that is the more successful group, are more likely to have decided that they're already implementing IoT or they're planning for this year. Next slide, please. Or they're also more likely to say they're currently looking at it or have already rejected it. So those top two categories, no plans, And sometime in 2018 is where less successful companies dominate. And what that really means is they really haven't gotten their arms around thinking about IoT, which is bad. Because if you're not thinking about IoT, as we'll see later, IoT is already thinking about you and is probably already embedded in your environment and not in a good way. Next slide. Another thing to look at is how important IoT security is. And keep in mind that we asked folks out of a long laundry list how important various things were, and one of them was securing IoT. Next slide, please. What you find is that successful companies, surprise, surprise, are more likely to consider securing IoT a high or critical priority than less successful companies who list it as either, more likely to list it as either not applicable, not a priority. Well, actually, some successful companies say it's not a priority, and that comes back to the fact that they've already done a good assessment and they know whether or not it matters. But less successful companies tend to rate the importance of IoT security as less important. Next slide, please. So great. Now you've got the basic notion that you should be thinking about IoT, but who should really own IoT security? Should it be the IoT group? Should it be the security group? Should it be some third-party group? And what we found is, once again, more successful companies are more likely to have InfoSec own IoT security. Next slide, please. So of the folks that are currently planning or currently responsible for IoT security, they're more likely, the successful folks are more likely to have it either planning for 2017 or responsible now. 2018. The difference between 2017 and 2018 is actually kind of interesting because there, less successful companies are actually more likely to say they're planning to have InfoSec own IoT. But notice also the percentage, more successful companies are already thinking about IoT security from the standpoint of InfoSec. So that's an important piece there as well. Next slide. Owning is an organizational issue. Funding is where the rubber meets the road. And one of the questions we asked is, who funds IoT security? We actually asked, again, a whole lot of other security areas, facility security. We asked about network security. We asked all sorts of different funding questions, and IoT was kind of buried in there. So it's not something that we zeroed in on and shown a spotlight on for a very good reason. As you can see, more successful companies are about equally likely to have InfoSec funded, have IoT security funded, but in a line item on someone else's budget. That's the middle. And John, next slide, please. They are considerably more likely to have it included in the InfoSec budget, and they're considerably less likely to not have a line item for InfoSec security. So essentially, whether InfoSec owns or doesn't own IoT security, they definitely should be funding it based on the success correlations here. In fact, 60% more often, the difference between 30% and 48%. Next slide, please. Also, and this is surprising, successful companies tend to have larger teams. So basically, we asked how many folks, we asked again across a broad range of security areas, we asked about how many folks were specifically focused on IoT security. And if they said less than one, we actually categorized them as zero. And if they had, 1 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 20, more than 20, you can kind of see the buckets that we ended up putting them in. If you go to the next slide, please. The areas where the blue bars are longer than the yellow bars tend to be the areas where the teams are larger than 6, or actually 6 or higher. And that's actually a very important thing to be aware of, because overall security teams aren't that large. So you're talking about putting in place InfoSec teams that are fairly significant in size, which is actually fairly important to understand. So IoT security teams, are fairly significant size. So the size of the team is also pretty critical here. Next slide, please. Now we get to the fun part. We've said it's important, just to recap, we've said it's important thus far to know what you're doing from an IoT perspective, know why you're IoT IoT initiative is in place. It's also very important for you to have InfoSec own the security component of IoT, own the budgeting of IoT security, and have a large team in place to address IoT security. All good stuff. But what about the critical operational elements to make sure that IoT security actually happens? So one question we asked about was the status of IoT security specific strategy. Next slide, please. And what we found, no surprise here, more successful companies either have one or are planning for one within the next year and a half. What we found generally is, with a few exceptions, including cloud, which you'll hear more about in our next webinar, generally having a strategy correlates pretty highly with success. And there's a reason for that, because when you've got something as complex as IoT, there's a lot of moving parts, and you really want to understand the security strategy for something that complex so that it helps you make decisions downstream as to what technologies to buy, to what processes to put in place, and then across the board, how well to integrate what you're doing in IoT with everything else you're doing organizationally. And in fact, that's one of the big things that is not yet happening inside of organizations. Companies are treating IoT in a complete silo, and we'll come back to this in just a second. So even if they have an IoT security strategy, it's not necessarily aligned with either the IT strategy or the security strategy. So what we're seeing in a lot of companies is there may be separate strategies for security, IT infrastructure, and IoT. That's a problem, and that's a problem that you need to address if you're one of those companies, because you really need to be aligning everything so that you can get not only economies of scale, so that you're deploying the same products across all areas where they make sense. So for example, a monitoring tool can play a role in security, in a general security strategy, an IoT security strategy, and a general infrastructure management strategy. But also because these seams are where the vulnerabilities creep in, and that's why very big companies can sometimes be caught absolutely flat-footed when it comes to IoT security. The next critical component that successful companies tend to have is an architecture. Next slide, please. Okay, and next slide after that, just to highlight. You get the idea of how to read these. So once again, very, very typical slide. Companies tend to have an IoT security specific architecture. I just want to highlight each of those words. It's not just having a security architecture, which most companies don't have, by the way. It's not just having an IoT architecture, which most companies that have a formal IoT initiative actually do have, because it's pretty hard to build something without having an architecture for it. We're talking about something that is the Venn diagram intersection between the two, which is IoT security specific architecture. It's pretty uncommon, as you can see, that most companies don't fall into those buckets, whether they're successful or not. In fact, less than 20% of successful companies even have an IoT security specific architecture, but it's worth knowing that they do. But still, it correlates pretty tightly with success to have an architecture built. Next slide, please. Last but not least, thank you. Last but not least, same results with a roadmap, except for the fact that the percentage of folks who have a roadmap is a little bit higher than the percentage of the folks that actually have an architecture, which is bad but good. And what I mean by that is it's bad in the sense that you really should not be developing a roadmap without an architecture, because the architecture is what tells you what products you should put on the roadmap when. On the other hand, you can kind of do a quick and dirty back of the envelope architecture and then move on to the roadmap and be not too far off from correct if you are hip deep in the project. So we know more companies have roadmaps than tend to have architectures. They shouldn't do it that way, because discussing and debating the architecture actually helps you understand better which products you need and when. But still, at some point, you have to have a roadmap for rolling out those products and for selecting those products and for applying selection criteria. And it's good to see that successful companies are much more likely to have that when it comes to IoT security specific issues. So those are some of the characteristics of more successful companies. But wait, there's more. Next slide, please. The big surprise here, and this is something that has not yet happened, that most companies are not yet aware of, is this concept of shadow IoT. And you may be thinking, what exactly is shadow IoT? Shadow IoT is, well, actually, John, not yet. thank you, but shadow IoT is actually the network of things that are smart, that are intelligent, that need to be upgraded, that have can potentially be vectors of bugs, that can be botnet armies, and that nobody is managing or distributing in the context of either an IoT initiative or a security initiative. So now, John, first one is security cameras. First one is security cameras. Printers is another great example. For security cameras, there have been recent breaches and exploits that have targeted security cameras to create botnet armies that they can then use for DDoS attacks and other flavors of attacks on other organizations. So we're not even talking about hacking into your security camera and trying to see things. We're talking about using your security camera or your printer as a member of a botnet army that can be used for a DDoS attack, can be used for all sorts of attacks going out further. And another example is next, elevators. Most elevators are now intelligent. I've been told from the folks that manufacture them that they may have as many as 300 intelligent CPUs in there, each running a particular version of software, each getting upgraded at particular points in time with absolutely no attention being paid to vulnerabilities that get introduced, with the people managing them not even thinking in terms of cybersecurity. When was the last time you sat down with facilities and said, okay, let's talk about cybersecurity in the elevators? If your answer is anytime in 2017, you're way ahead of the curve. Next item, HVAC systems, another huge one. Smart heaters, smart thermostats, smart air conditioning. Again, elevators and HVAC systems can both be used to serve as members of botnet armies, as well as, in the case of elevators, you can put some real damage to an organization by mucking around with the elevators. And those are just the normal things that are currently in place in most facilities. Pretty much everybody's offices have security cameras, printers, elevators, and HVAC systems. Now here come a couple things that you may not have. Next, HMI agents like Alexa. True story. I was actually visiting a client who is in the financial services space. We were sitting in his office talking about, telling stories about Alexa, and I said something like Alexa something something, and the one on his desk that I had previously not noticed turned on and wanted to know what she could do for me. These are dangerous on lots of fronts. First of all, of course, the possibility for embedding recording software in there is huge, and most people have actually thought about it. But once again, they're sources of vulnerability on all sorts of levels if they get hacked. And another example is, next, drones. And you may be thinking, hey, who has drones and doesn't know about it? And actually, the HMI agents and the drones, in both cases, people think, oh, I don't have them in my organization. Whenever somebody says that, all I do is think back about 10 years ago when we had clients telling us with a straight face, oh, we don't have Wi-Fi in our organization. It's not allowed. And then you go into the organization and you do a quick scan and you realize they've got all kinds of illicit hotspots, totally unsecured, totally all over the place. That's what you're seeing with HMI agents and drones. People are bringing drones in and using them for all sorts of things, and they're highly hackable and present, great vulnerabilities. And oh, by the way, like this one here, they can be carrying cameras, and so they're doubly, they can be doubly dangerous. The kicker is with all of this shadow IT, literally none of the folks we spoke with has an organization that looks at all of these components together consistently and all the other areas in physical facilities that are not part of a formal IoT initiative. So, you may be, and a great example is, you may be a manufacturer of equipment, and you may go ahead and instrument all the equipment that you're manufacturing with all kinds of sensors and links into the cloud so that your equipment can tell you what the weather's doing and where it is and how it's performing and what its utilization is, and essentially serving as a mobile IoT network like lots and lots of people are doing. And you may, as a manufacturing company, be plowing enormous amounts of resources into figuring out how to do this securely, how to do it well, how to integrate it back, how to transport that data to your clients. And you probably are not thinking at all about who's managing the security of the security camera on the manufacturing plant floor. It's not even in your in your field of vision because you're so focused on your formal IoT initiative and not thinking at all about the shadow IoT initiative. It's also the case that when you look at the tools, which is something we'll do in a subsequent webinar, when you look at the tools are actually focused much more heavily on the formal IoT initiatives. So again, if you're a manufacturing company that's instrumenting your construction equipment, there are all kinds of tools out there. You can get embedded security all the way through the entire IoT architecture. It won't talk to your InfoSec security, and it certainly won't talk to your shadow IoT security. So basically, if you come away from this presentation with nothing else other than that you might be behind the curve when it comes to implementing some of the best practices around formal IoT security, you should come out of this with the concept of shadow IoT and why it's a terrible, terrible thing, because it opens up enormous vulnerabilities precisely because nobody's paying for it. Nobody's paying attention to it, which means nobody's budgeting for it, nobody's staffing for it, nobody's thinking about it, and nobody's extending security architectures to it. Next slide, please. So when you compare them side to side, your planned IoT initiative, typically, if you're successful, if you've been following along, you have a strategy, you have an architecture, you have a roadmap. You have clear business goals. You have a defined security budget that's funding it. Everything we've said in the past 29 slides minus slide number 30, which was the threat of shadow IoT. You have a defined project team. You can, most people haven't, but you can integrate your planned IoT initiative into your overarching security strategy. Next. For shadow IoT, there is no strategy, no architecture, no roadmap, no clear business goals or operational processes, no defined project team or ownership. The responsibility is split among facilities, lines of business, IT, whoever happens to be managing printers, which may be procurement. There's certainly no budget to fund shadow IoT, and yet, and partly because of these reasons, shadow IoT becomes the biggest IoT threat. So at this point in the presentation, I hope you're walking away thinking, good heavens, there's a lot that we need to do just to secure our existing IoT initiatives, but we also have to think about this whole entire shadow IoT component that we have not been thinking about in the past. Next slide. So what should you do with all this information? No surprise here, it's pretty straightforward. First and foremost, when you get up from your desk after this presentation, you should consider launching a shadow IoT vulnerability assessment. What we mean by that is find out how many smart devices are in your environment, even the ones that you're confident aren't in your environment. You don't have drones, right? Find out, prove that you don't have drones. So do a checklist assessment, see what's there, see what might be there, look at your HVAC systems, look at your elevators, look at your facilities, and get together a team that is going to be responsible for the security of all of these disparate components. Launch formal projects, if you don't have them already, formal projects for both IoT security and shadow IoT security. And again, the word security is important. You probably already have a formal project for IoT. We're talking about a formal project for IoT security. And similarly, you probably don't have a formal project for shadow IoT. That's kind of the definition of the shadow, but you do need a formal project to secure it. Have InfoSec own those? Yes, even shadow IoT, and have InfoSec own the budget. InfoSec, if you're from InfoSec, you're thinking, oh, great, more work. Thanks, Johna. And if you're not from InfoSec, you're thinking, oh, great, more for them to do, and they're swamped already. Yes, sad but true. But it's very important because you don't want to be reinventing the wheel when it comes to security for shadow IoT or IoT. Security actually is a pretty well understood discipline. It's just impossible to get anything perfectly secure, but you can certainly drive down the risk by appropriately applying the right principles and the right technologies, and InfoSec are the folks, if you're doing a good job with your InfoSec, they are the folks that are best equipped to be addressing this. Create and staff IoT security specific teams with responsibility for both formal and shadow IoT, and that N=1 is have more than one person responsible for all this. If you have any IoT whatsoever, you really cannot get away with just one person, or worse, half a person worried about that. Make sure you have an IoT security specific strategy, architecture, and roadmap. And oh, by the way, if you want help with any of this, do give us a call. Next slide, please. here's how we can help. We have an IoT-Security Strategic Support Program. If you're a technology user, which it includes but is not limited to IT, InfoSec, or marketing, or other folks, we can help you develop policies, business cases, strategies, and all the good things we're telling you should get, architecture and roadmap, as well as helping you to make the strategic selection among vendors for IoT security. We can also provide data-based guidance on staffing, spending, budgeting. You know, one of the questions we haven't talked about is how much should you be spending? How should you be operating? What are your success metrics? All of that we can assist you with. If you happen to be on the other side of the fence and you're building this stuff, you're a vendor, you're a carrier, you're a VAR, you're putting it together, we've got good insight into what people are doing. That's what the market trend and customer sentiment analysis is. And again, we can assist with things like marketing, product strategy, go-to-market strategies. Here, if you're a vendor, for example, we will certainly give you our thoughts on how to solve some of the problems we talked about here, such as integrating with risk management dashboards so that your customers and our customers can get that single pane of glass view of all the vulnerabilities introduced by technology into their environments, whether it's formal IoT, shadow IoT, or regular standard issue infrastructure. And as part of all of our services, you get ongoing support, telephone advisory service, the ability to submit written inquiries, and access to our data. So this is all great stuff, and if you're an Nemertes client, you may be thinking, wait, am I getting that already? In fact, you are. Next slide. If you are a client and you want access to all this goodness, please contact Nemertes Client Services at hopefully at the email address above. You're welcome to call us as well. If you're not a client, you know where this is going. Please contact Nemertes Sales, and we will happily make you a client and assist you along your IoT security journey, whether that is from the IT side of the house and having the strategy, roadmap, architecture, vision, success metrics, or whether that's on the provider side of the house. So with that, I believe I hand back over to you, John, to talk a bit about our upcoming webinar, and then we take some questions.
That's entirely correct. So hi. Our next webinar, which will take place on Tuesday, August 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, will be entitled How to Save Money, Get Agile, and Boost Performance as You Migrate to the Cloud, the Nemertes Cloud Maturity Model. And we'll be taking a deep dive into exactly that. We're looking at the measures by which you can gauge the maturity of your cloud operation, and we will draw the lines connecting the dots from those characteristics to the ability to perform better using cloud systems and to do so without breaking the bank, i.e. without spending more on the cloud solutions than you're spending on do-it-yourself solutions provided out of your own data centers. I'll be the presenter for that one, and I believe Johna will be my co-pilot that time.
I will.
So
that'll be fun.
Please join us if you can. And with that, we will shift over to the Q&A portion of the day. And Johna, I've got a nice stack of questions piled up here. And we'll take them roughly in order of arrival, starting with funding. Regarding funding sources, how are companies getting sales or marketing to pitch in? And what does it mean that they're providing funding? Are they covering the whole bill or what?
That is absolutely a great question, and the cop-out answer happens to be correct in this case, which is it depends. In a lot of cases, what tends to happen, and I'm going a bit off topic here when it comes to digital transformation, but in digital transformation, and in the most successful digital transformation projects, there's usually a very senior level leader who is leading a cross-disciplinary exercise for digital transformation. So translate this buzzwords into English. There's somebody pretty high up in the company who says, you know what, guys, I think we can make a ton more money using digital transformation if we optimize our sales processes using crowdsourcing or something like that, just pulling something out of the air. So that person is going to pull sales in, pull IT in, pull in InfoSec, pull in marketing, possibly marketing operations, client services, whoever is needed, and those folks sit down and start figuring out all sorts of things. Who's funding it? What the team should look like, how many people should be on the team, and that's where sales comes in. So the answer you seem to be looking for there, Anne, is kind of, well, how does an IT person go about requesting sales? And sort of the short answer is usually they don't. Usually it comes from someone who's senior to both sales and IT who says, okay, guys, let's work together to make this successful. That said, before we go on to the next couple questions, I want to highlight that very often when you're envisioning an IoT or any other initiative, what can work very, very well is if you want to do a pilot project. I mean, just as an example, for an IoT pilot project, we were talking to a large university that wanted to use drones in the library so that you could actually capture information that was physically hard to reach, so you couldn't get at it. And literally what happened was IT kind of went to the business unit, in this case not sales, but in this case the library, and said, listen, we think we can make this happen. Let's try to get a short, sweet proof of concept out there, make it work, something that requires minimal funding, and they funded it out of their joint operational expenses. So there wasn't a whole project launch business case analysis. They got it up and running, showcased that it worked, and then arm in arm went back to the COO of the university to get better funding. And that's actually one of the best ways to jumpstart the whole, let's get the potential business user engaged in funding the initiative. So, and that all translates, that's all talking about IoT, not IoT security specifically, but obviously IT would have a vested interest in making sure anything that gets done securely. Next up.
Sure thing. So this is a two-parter, and I'll give you part one here. Could you recap what you mean by more successful and less successful, the definitions of the gold and blue bars?
Sure. And there are two separate definitions for our two separate studies. In digital transformation, there are actually a slew of definitions that include things like, if the goal was increase revenue, did they increase revenue by a certain percent? And I forget what the percent was. But you know, they're clear business metrics. So companies that increased revenue by more than 60% or whatever the number was, we counted them as successful. And similarly, for each of those business drivers, you had to perform well on those business drivers to count as the successful group. Again, within security, if you had your security operational metrics such that you were responding very quickly to breaches, you were in that successful group. So that's really the correlation there. So the definition of success for security was someone who was able to respond to security breaches in record time, which is really an indicator of a highly well-functioning security organization. So those are the two different definitions.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. And part two, you mentioned obviously being used as a bot in a botnet for denial of service attacks as a specific IoT security concern, but it's not specific to IoT. It's generic to systems that can be taken over and used that way. Are there any concerns that are more specific to IoT?
And that is a great question. There are. There's actually, one is spying. So in other words, it's data access. So whatever your sensors or monitors are doing, that data can potentially be leaked to someone else and used against you. So for example, if you're manufacturing equipment and you're embedding that equipment in sensors, your competitors can certainly find out what you're doing. And more importantly, you can actually, let's say you're a state agent and you're very interested in finding out, I don't know, the details of U.S. agriculture or something like that. Well, all of a sudden, you can do that now by hacking into the network of tractors that are out there. And you can get a very granular level data set. If you can get into every tractor that's out there and you know exactly what people are doing, you get some real insight into the current and future food supply, which may be useful. I'm kind of stretching on that, but you can see where bad guys can get access to data, and IoT gives you all sorts of data at a whole new level. The last one is, and this is the biggest one, if it's not just a sensor, but it's actually a control network, you can do some real damage. I mean, the classic, a better example for sensing, for example, might be patient information. You could get access to patient information in hospitals. Well, gee, if you can also stop the equipment, you can actually stop the breathing machine. And you can do things like, we've all heard about the attack on the hotels where all of a sudden the card keys didn't work anymore, so the guests can't get into the room unless the hotel decides to cough up extortion money. So just imagine what happens if you go into a hospital and say, hey, Mount Sinai, we're basically turning off all your breathing machines, so you pretty much have about 8 minutes to give us $10 million. Do it now. Or anyone else that's got a network that involves, self-driving cars. The possibilities are limitless. So control networks are super scary. Fortunately, we haven't gotten to the point where there are a lot of control networks, but just getting access to that monitoring information is also super scary. I don't know. I mean, just to take a recent example, we have John McCain going to the hospital with a brain tumor. Some outside agent may decide it's very useful to know John McCain's diagnosis before, for example, the market's open, because he's going to be casting a deciding vote on healthcare. And so if you're a pharmaceutical company, you might actually want to know whether John McCain is going to make it to cast that vote. So these are all examples of very specific to IoT information that are risks.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Let's see. Got time for a couple more. So, excuse me. We know that in the world of digital transformation, customer experience and the contact center are front and center in lots of initiatives. Is there a play for IoT in the contact center, and then any impact on consumer information security in that context?
Yes and maybe. So yes, there is a play for IoT for customer experience. In fact, the example that I gave, if you're making, say, tractors, you can improve the value of your tractors to the farmer by doing things like embedding sensors that tell you the quality of the soil, and maybe not just tractors, but maybe irrigation tools that irrigate based on the upcoming upcoming weather report, which is actually not a hypothetical. So the key point here is, as a customer, I'm now getting all sorts of great data about my fields that I probably wouldn't have had if I went to the competitor. So this improves my customer experience. It's not a standard customer experience, contact center example, but that's kind of the point. It doesn't have to be. And if you think about, Alexa and the information she can gather, that gets you to the consumer side. Alexa is 99% consumer, but increasingly becoming a staple in enterprise organizations. And there's all sorts of interesting ways that you can improve the customer experience using Alexa as well. So those are a couple of examples. So I think the moral of the story is think broader than just the contact center. Think about the customer experience overall, and that's where you start seeing IoT playing in.
That conversation, both contact center and Alexa, leads very nicely into this question, skipping in the order of the queue a little bit. Did you hear about any concerns about data and data privacy, especially as it relates to unauthorized recording of voices and storage of those conversations without a participant's knowledge, and employment law?
Absolutely. That is a huge concern. And that's another security risk. I sort of touched on it when I mentioned PPI when it comes to, and HIPAA violations in hospital scenarios, but absolutely, that's a major concern. You should be worried about it, especially you, because I know who submitted that question.
And let's see, at a fairly statistical kind of level, do you see any correlation between success of IoT projects and size of the organization?
And John, didn't we get asked this like last week or the week before? And I don't know that we've run those numbers.
I think that was on DT projects actually, but yeah.
Yeah, but and the short answer is we don't know, but we'll take that as an action item of something to find out, because there are two hypotheses, both of which could be equally true, right, or equally likely to be true. One is small companies are actually more successful because they're nimble. This cooperation between sales and IT is a lot easier in a small organization. The other one is, the obvious, big organizations have more resources and therefore they're more likely to be successful. So we'll take that as an action item. We know who asked it, so we're able to get that back, and we will dig into that.
And lastly, VR came up. And do you see any emerging IoT security concerns in VR, especially in healthcare?
Yes, lots, very much. And we actually asked about that. I don't have the data, but we did capture it. We actually asked about the level of deployment of VR. And what's happening is VR isn't, and for those of you who are wondering, it's virtual reality, and we also looked at augmented reality. The biggest, first of all, let me finish my first thought. Folks are not yet as far down the path as we thought they might be, but we're keeping an eye on that because we expect it to explode within the next year or two. So we expect that's going to be huge. For security concerns, absolutely, we can imagine all kinds of security concerns with virtual reality, especially in healthcare. And in fact, in healthcare, especially as you get into things like telemedicine, even infrastructure failure can be critical. I mean, you really do not want to imagine that, the network failure means the doctor that's operating on you just got disconnected from the robot while your heart is, while he's doing open heart surgery on you. So yes, short answer is absolutely, and we can go into that in much greater length over the next, days, weeks, and months.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you all for your questions today. It's been a great batch, and by all means, follow up in email if you've got further questions for us, and we'll have the conversation. With that, we will wrap up today's webinar. Thank you very much for your time and attention today. And again, please join us for our next webinar on Tuesday, August 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, How to Save Money, Get Agile, and Boost Performance as you migrate to the cloud, the Nemertes Cloud Maturity Model, presented by me, John Burke. A registration link will be posted to our website, and if you would like to follow up with us and our client, please send an email to clientservices@nemertes.com. If you are not a client, please send an email to research@nemertes.com or sales@nemertes.com. Again, thank you very much, and this concludes the webinar.